Hi, so at the conclusion of the debate, we've got a professional photographer who will take some photos of the winning team with their cup and of the opposition team as well. So they'll come out the front of this lectern afterwards and we'll get those photographs all done. We have a pretty tight schedule, so I know whoever wins will be excited, but come here first, then hug your parents after that, okay? Get this part down. Okay. My name is Sonia Lowen and I'm the chairman of Debating SA. So welcome to today's grand final. We're honoured to be here today and it seems fitting that we are in this august chamber. Helen Keller said, "Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired and success achieved." And it probably feels like that you've done that to get to this point, so congratulations. So the young people we're about to debate have shown such character in order for them to have arrived now at the grand final. I'd like to also thank you to all the parents and coaches who support the endeavours of these young people. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2024 Year 10 Division Debating SA Grand Final debate. My name is Monique Beattie, and I'm the chairman of this debate. And the timekeeper here is Michaela Carr. The topic of this debate is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The affirmative team seated to my right is Endeavour College Blue, consisting of the first speaker, Chang, second speaker, Samantha Perryman, and third speaker, Flynn Hutchinson. The negative team seated to my left is from Endeavour College Endeavour College Green, which consists of the first speaker, Rachel Rach, second speaker, Olivia Vasilev, and third speaker, Alex Falkner. The grand final debate will be judged by a panel of 5 adjudicators, who are Miss Liliana France, Professor Alan Johnson, Miss Chelsea Hermer, Mr. Jonathan Parkadillis, and Miss Charlotte Boyd-Turner. The speaking time of this debate is 6 minutes, with a warning bell sounding at 5 minutes, and a double bell will sound at 6 minutes. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please switch off your mobile phones and other electronic devices. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Chang.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic of tonight's debate is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. We, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement to be true. As your first speaker, I'll be talking about how the Paris Agreement isn't working as expected and fails to address external economical and social factors. Our second speaker, Samantha, will be talking about how the agreement restricts Australia's critical minerals and isn't a good fit. Our third speaker, Flynn, will be rebutting the opposition and summarising our team case. We define the Paris Agreement as a legally binding international treaty on climate change, with its goal being to limit the global average temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to attempt to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, according to the United Nations. Every 5 years, each country is expected to submit an updated national climate action plan, known as Nationally Determined Contribution. We define a withdrawal as a take-back or drawback, or to cease to participate in activity, according to the Collins and Oxford dictionaries, respectively. My first point is that the Paris Agreement is not working as intended. As you can guess, the Paris Agreement is a pretty big deal, with 196 parties signing it, meaning 196 ambitious plans for climate change, and in turn, 196 things which need to go right. As you're probably putting together, there is a lot of room for error. I'll raise a question. Why should Australia participate in an agreement that takes our money, our resources, and that isn't even working? Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of UN Climate Change, says that current levels of climate ambition are not on track to meet our Paris Agreement goals. In fact, several scientific climate change studies, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Climate Council, Climate NASA, have shown that the Earth's temperature over the past year was more than 1.6 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial average. effectively making one of the major goals of the Paris Agreement no longer scientifically possible, according to the US Institute of Peace. The Paris Agreement has an inherent flaw within the system, being too big to set good boundaries. The agreement's key method of peer pressure among countries to ameliorate their NDCs is threatened by domestic issues and global crises, such as the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, according to PhD holders Tegan Blaine and Daniel Reif-Snyder. In fact, little participating countries are actually meeting these goals. The Global Stockdale Technical Synthesis Report on Climate Change says that much more is needed on fronts, with the climate change tracker saying that no country has achieved the 1.5 degrees Celsius emissions limit. Alongside this, China's target is effectively non-binding, with China being the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, with 23.75% of global emissions. China taking part in the Paris Agreement means that these emissions are to peak by 2030. This means that no matter what China does, it would be adhering to the Paris Agreement, just as long as their emissions decrease after 2030. The thing is, the Paris Agreement loses its hold in 2030, practically meaning that China is not affected, according to research fellow Daniel Wild. So, if one of the major goals of the Paris Agreement isn't scientifically feasible, countries aren't on track to completing their NDCs, and the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, China, isn't even bound by the Paris Agreement, then what can the agreement even do about climate change? Well, very little. Dr. Bjorn Lomborg, using the latest climate model MAGICC6, finds that even if all goals of the Paris Agreement were to be fulfilled from 2016 to 2030, the temperature reduced in 2100 would only be by 0.05 degrees Celsius. 0.05 degrees. That's only if all commitments are met. As you can see, the Paris Agreement is not on the right track, with some goals impossible and countries not meeting their standards, and others being unrestrained by the agreement. Not only that, but even if everything were to go right, the environmental change would be very, very little, and to reiterate, everything is definitely not going right. Why should Australia continue to partake in the Paris Agreement if it isn't even working, and no less taking our money and resources? Right cause, wrong method, as I'll be explaining in my next point. My second point is that the Paris Agreement only focuses on the number of emissions, failing to address any financial or economical issues. Have you ever heard of that joke where no matter the subject of a board meeting, you can say, we need to find a balance, and everyone will nod and agree with you? Well, Australia needs that balance, and the Paris Agreement doesn't provide it. But only looking through one lens and failing to address any of the other issues that come with upholding this goal for climate change, it causes irreparable damage to the economy. Take the whole corona incident, for example. They couldn't just put everybody in lockdown when they attempted to help the epidemic. They need to take into consideration what the social needs of people, the financial needs of businesses and organizations. They need to balance their costs and what was needed of the economy. The Paris Agreement demands specific, increasingly ambitious goals within a tight time frame, and this doesn't allow Australia to address other consequences that come with fulfilling the requirements of the agreement. The Institute of Public Affairs has estimated that the net present value cost of meeting the Paris Agreement emission reduction requirement to be a grand total of $52 billion, this number representing the additional cost of generating electricity, including a lower productivity growth due to a higher use of wind and solar power. This results in increased business costs, as a repercussion, lower after-tax profits, lower business investments, employment growth, and wage growth, effectively throwing a brick at the economy. Does not sound good. You might also be under the impression that the Paris Agreement is flexible, allowing countries to set their own goals. However, this agreement has a tight time frame, with each country being expected to submit an NDC every 5 years, according to the World Resources Institute. Forcing countries to make this change within a short period of time, along with the sheer scale of money needed to truly fulfill these goals for the tunnel-visioned lenses of the Paris Agreement, which take an enormous toll on the economy. Should Australia really continue to partake in an agreement that doesn't even work, and no less takes away our money and economic stability? So, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairperson, as you can clearly see, Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement because the agreement isn't working as intended and the structure of the agreement is flawed due to tunnel vision. Thank you.
I now call upon the first negative speaker, Rachel Raj.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic of this afternoon's debate is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. We, the negative team, believe this statement to be false, and tonight I will be telling you why. But first, I will provide a definition. Whilst we agree with the definition provided by the Affirmative team, we would like to add some further context for this debate. In the context of this debate, if Australia was to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, it would mean that we would be leaving a plan for a healthier future that was planned with 195 other countries. Tonight, I will be explaining how staying in the agreement preserves Australia's global partnerships and how it would maintain our credibility and influence. Our second speaker, Olivia, will be telling you the science behind reducing global warming, how it is not about the end goal, and that we will miss the opportunity to build the future economy with green technologies. Our third speaker, Alex, will be providing a summary of our points for the day. Now, to rebut the opposing team's points. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that the emissions gap after 2030, which the total reduction in emissions is 43%, is massive. This goal may seem ambitious at first, especially when you look at the research done by the UNFCCC in 2023, which showed that at that point in time, emissions would continue to increase past 2030. However, they have more recently stated that emissions will not increase any further in 2030, almost entirely due to this goal. This shows how this seemingly gigantic goal is manageable and helps us become closer to the overarching goal. Now to my first point for the day. Staying in the Paris Agreement is crucial for Australia to preserve its influence in global negotiations and maintain strong international partnerships. According to Professor Emma Patterson from Monash University, if Australia were to withdraw, it could jeopardise our relationships with key trading partners like China, Japan, and South Korea. These countries are increasingly committed to net zero emission targets. According to Geoscience Australia, these nations are major importers of Australian coal and resources, and their transition to greener policies underscore a shift towards sustainable practices. If Australia withdraws from the agreement and fails to align with these international climate commitments, we risk facing trade sanctions. For example, according to the University of Cambridge Press, countries within the European Union have considered introducing border carbon adjustments, which would impose tariffs on goods from nations that fail to meet climate commitments. This not only threatens Australia's export markets for carbon-intensive resources, but could also threaten our competitive edge in today's evolving global economy. Upholding the Paris Agreement means that Australia remains a valued partner, therefore protecting our economic interests and fostering future-oriented trade relationships. If Australia does not stay committed with these international climate commitments, we risk facing substantial economic repercussions. This point is further strengthened by research conducted by Bruce O'Hara from Oxford University, which shows that countries with strict climate policies may impose trade sanctions on goods from nations who refuse to sign the Paris Agreement to protect their own green initiatives. Furthermore, a study done by Dr. Frank Giozzo from the Australian National University highlights that countries that adhere to climate targets are likely to create trade barriers against targets from nations that don't support green initiatives. If Australia were to pull out of the Paris Agreement, it will significantly impact Australia's export markets as well as our international partnerships. This leads me to my second point for this afternoon. If we were to leave the Paris Agreement, our credibility and influence would be severely damaged. Australia's active participation in the Paris Agreement shows our commitment to the environment, as well as our willingness to collaborate with many different nations. According to Monash University's Climate Work Centre, the agreement has played a key role in driving international collaboration on climate policy, particularly by pushing nations like Australia to align their national goals with global climate ambitions. If we were to withdraw, it would put a strain on our relationship with other countries. If we bow out of this agreement, what's stopping us from doing the same with any other agreement? By bowing out of this agreement, it could make other countries wary of approaching us in the future. Furthermore, according to a report by the Climate Council titled The Lost Years, for Australia to maintain influence, we must adopt credible climate policies and demonstrate leadership globally. The Paris Agreement is central operation for climate decisions. If we were to step out, our influence would be lessened and our ability to make large climate decisions would be largely reduced. By withdrawing from the agreement, backlash could be received from the public of Australia. According to a study written by Professor Linda Schneider from the University of Melbourne, we have made it a point in the past that we are moving with the changing climate views, and if we were to pull out now, the public would not agree. There would be significant social backlash. If we were to withdraw from the agreement, our credibility and influence would be severely damaged. So, ladies, gentlemen, Madam Chairperson, in conclusion, Australia should not withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Our trade partnerships would be damaged, as well as our credibility and influence. It could negatively affect Australia's economy. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Samantha Perryman.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic for today's debate is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. As the affirmative team, we strongly believe this statement to be true. Our first speaker, Hayley, has talked about how the Paris Agreement isn't working as originally intended, and it fails to acknowledge other prevalent issues. As your second speaker, I'll be introducing how the Paris Agreement restricts critical minerals and how the agreement is not a good fit for our country. Our third speaker, Flynn, will be rebutting the negative team and summarising our team case. We acknowledge the alteration in definition, but would like to reaffirm their wording as a plan for a better future. Before I continue to my points, I would like to rebut one of the opposition's arguments. The negative team has tried to tell you that withdrawing from the Paris Agreement will impose trade penalties. This argument relies on the assumption that global markets will punish non-compliance. However, there is no evidence for this. According to the Brookings Institution, when the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2017 under President Trump, US trade with the EU, China, and other parties continued as usual. The World Bank reported that the US GDP grew 2.4% in 2017, 2.9% in 2018, and 2.3% in 2019. This indicates that the decision to leave the Paris Agreement simply did not significantly harm overall economic performance. My first point is that the Paris Agreement is restricting Australia's critical minerals. Critical minerals are defined by the Australian government geoscience sector as a metallic or non-metallic element that is essential for modern technologies, economies, or national security, and has a supply chain at risk of disruption. So, in short, it's a mineral that is necessary to our world. Let's look at one critical mineral in particular, lithium. Lithium is most commonly used in batteries and powers the lives of millions every day, according to the Department of Energy. Lithium batteries are used in things like mobile phones, power tools, and home appliances. The Australians Identified Mineral Resources Report informs us that Australia remains the world's largest producer of lithium, supplying 52% of the global total. As well as lithium, Australia is the world's largest exporter of black coal, iron ore, alumina, lead, zinc, and is the second largest exporter of uranium. Okay, we need minerals, Australia has minerals, got it. But the Paris Agreement is putting strain on critical minerals, and it affects Australia the most. Some critical minerals, like cobalt and nickel, can have high carbon footprints due to the energy-intensive processes involved in their extraction and refinement. So their emissions are significant, but these minerals are essential to the production of many green technologies, such as solar panels. How do we balance this need with climate action? The Minerals Council of Australia also find it hard to comprehend how necessity is being compromised, publishing that there is no doubt that while the merits of climate action are acknowledged and supported by the mining industry, the task remains formidable. To meet current demand for electricity storage alone, the world requires 50 new lithium mines, 60 new nickel mines, and 17 cobalt mines. Global mining investment is expected to increase by $100 billion US annually to produce the mineral commodities required to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. To build the amount of renewable energy technology required to meet our emissions targets, Australia needs more of our critical minerals out of the ground, more lithium for batteries, more copper for solar panels, and more cobalt for electric vehicles. The Paris Agreement is limiting our view of mining to only see the emissions. These emissions are a downside, don't get me wrong, but instead of allowing for sustainable development and innovation, the agreement pushes for reduced emissions from mining now. Australia, as the global mining leader, needs to find its own goals to protect the balance. This is why Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. My second point is that the Paris Agreement is simply not a good fit for Australia. The Paris Agreement, as the name suggests, was developed in France. France has many surrounding countries such as Spain, Germany, and Belgium, who share extremely similar geological features and resources. As such, the pledges outlined by France works well for these countries. Australia, as a largely yet sparsely populated country surrounded by water, faces very different conditions that don't necessarily line up with these internationally devised goals. According to Professor Guo from the Monash University of Public Health, Australia has already warmed by 1.47 degrees Celsius since 1910, accompanied by more frequent and intense extreme heat events. The country has also experienced one of the greatest increases in bushfire risk globally, prolonged droughts in the south of the country, and increase in extreme floods in the wetter northern parts. These risks are likely to escalate with devastating consequences for Australia's population, economy, and environment. There's a lot hanging in the balance for Australia when it comes to climate change, and a global framework just won't cut it. A paper published by the Australian Industry Group states that Australia's reliance on specific industries, such as mining, impacts how it should approach climate policies. These unique risks necessitate tailored climate policies that address specific national vulnerabilities. Tailored strategies are necessary to balance economic interests with environmental goals. You might be thinking, well, yes, those in the Paris Agreement follow one goal, but their NDCs are self-determined, and you would be right. Every country makes their own nationally determined contributions, but under the guidelines of the agreement and at pressures of countries around the world, no country has yet altered or decreased their NDCs, but only 7 of the 195 countries involved are actually on track to meet these goals, according to the Climate Action Tracker. Why are we involved in such a loose international framework when we should be creating specific and correct goals within our own country? There's no doubt that something must be done about climate change, but Paris Agreement is not the solution for our country. In conclusion, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson, you can clearly see that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement because it restricts critical minerals and is not a good fit for Australia. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Olivia Vasilev.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. We, the negative team, believe this statement to be false, and as the negative team, we will clearly explain why this is incorrect. But first, I'll rebut the opposing team's points. The first affirmative speaker has claimed that meeting the Paris Agreement targets will negatively impact Australia's economy, particularly in industries like mining and energy. However, a report by the Deloitte Access Economics found that inaction on climate change could cost the Australian economy $3.4 trillion by 2070, far outweighing the short-term costs of transitioning to cleaner energy sources. Furthermore, renewable energy industries are expected to create new jobs and economic opportunities, especially in regional areas. Thus, the argument that leaving the Paris Agreement is necessary to protect the economy is flawed. Staying in the Paris Agreement ensures Australia's long-term economic stability and competitiveness in the global market. They have also claimed that the Paris Agreement has not effectively reduced global emissions. However, the agreement has fostered international cooperation and commitments that have led to significant emission reductions in many countries. For instance, the European Union has achieved a 24% reduction in emissions since 1990, demonstrating that collective action can yield results. This evidence underscores the effectiveness of the agreement in driving meaningful climate action. Our first speaker has already explained how remaining in the Paris Agreement upholds Australia's global partnerships and sustains our credibility and influence. Now to my first point. Australia's participation in the Paris Agreement is crucial for the global effort on climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC's, fifth assessment report underscores the importance of limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius to prevent severe climate impacts. Exceeding these limits could result in extreme weather events, sea level rise, ecosystem loss, species extinction, food and water security crises, and economic disasters. Based on this scientific census, the Paris Agreement sets clear, ambitious targets for reducing emissions and stabilizing global temperatures. Australia's role is significant due to its high per capita emissions. By committing to reduce emissions by 43% from 2005 levels by 2030, Australia demonstrates a strong commitment to the global framework designed to meet these temperature goals. According to Professor Will Steffen from the Australian National University, Australia's national commitments are crucial for meeting global emission reduction targets. Withdrawing from the Paris Agreement would also weaken the global effort, particularly given Australia's significant emissions. While some may argue that withdrawal could benefit the economy and reduce regulatory burdens, this short-term view fails to recognise the overwhelming scientific consensus. The IPCC warns that failing to meet climate targets could lead to costly and devastating climate impacts, far outweighing any short-term economic benefits. Remaining in the Paris Agreement aligns with a scientifically endorsed strategy crucial for mitigating global warming and avoiding its worst consequences. Now to my second point. Australia's commitment to the Paris Agreement is crucial for achieving climate goals through interim targets. In 2015, Australia pledged to work towards 2030 emission reduction targets and submit its 2035 plans by 2025. These interim targets are vital for tracking progress and making necessary adjustments to climate strategies. They act as essential milestones, ensuring that global efforts remain on course to limit temperature rise and manage climate risks effectively. The IPCC stresses the importance of these targets in evaluating and enhancing climate action. The Global Carbon Project highlights that interim commitments drive meaningful progress and coordination. By adhering to these targets, the Paris Agreement supports a structured and coordinated global approach, ensuring its role in international climate action remains impactful. Withdrawal from the Paris Agreement would undermine this coordinated approach and compromise the achievement of both national and regional climate goals. By staying committed, Australia secures its place as a key player in international climate action, ensuring that both its national and global responsibilities are met. Now to my third and final point. Australia's commitment to the Paris Agreement offers a critical opportunity to shape the future of the country's economy centred on green technologies. By remaining in the agreement, Australia aligns itself with global trends towards sustainable development and clean energy. The transition to a green economy is not just an environmental necessity, but an economic imperative. Moreover, the Reserve Bank of Australia highlights that increased investment in renewable projects, particularly in large-scale solar and wind generation, has driven economic growth. It has created jobs, especially in rural and regional areas where many renewable energy projects are based. Australia's involvement in the Paris Agreement positions us to take advantage of emerging markets for green technologies and innovations. Those leading this shift, like Australia, stand to benefit by advancing in areas such as renewable energy, electric vehicles, and energy-efficient technologies. Tony Wood, the Energy and Climate Change Program Director at the Grattan Institute, notes that countries committed to green goals often see substantial economic benefits and attract international investment. This is also highlighted by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which emphasizes that innovation in green technologies is essential for addressing climate change and spurring sustainable development. Withdrawing from the Paris Agreement would mean missing out on these opportunities. So, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, Australia must remain part of the Paris Agreement. Our participation is vital for tracking global progress, achieving critical targets, and harnessing the economic potential of green technologies. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Flynn Hutchinson.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic of this evening's debate is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. We, the Affirmative team, strongly agree with this statement. As your third speaker, I'll be summarizing my teammates' points, but first, I shall rebut the opposition's arguments. The negative team has tried to tell you that there are long-term economic consequences that come with withdrawing from the agreement. This does not have to be the case, and in fact, there is historical precedent to state otherwise. Australia's economy has a strong history of adapting to changes in policy and international agreements. To quote the Australian Productivity Commission, Australia has a strong track record of adapting to policy changes and integrating new economic frameworks. The nation's economic resilience and ability to pivot has been demonstrated across various sectors. While the Paris Agreement has provided a framework for transitioning to a low-carbon economy, Australia can continue to drive economic growth through alternative policies or arrangements. There is no reason to believe that the economy will suffer without the Paris Agreement. The negative team has tried to tell you that climate change will harm Australia. This is very true, but there are other significant factors that can encourage and even force climate action for our country. For example, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2017. However, by 2020, still before they rejoined, the US had reduced its carbon emissions by around 12% compared to 2005 levels, and coal consumption dropped by over 40% from 2010 to 2020, with renewable energy capacity also increasing significantly. This climate action was driven by a continued natural shift from coal to renewable energy, efforts by states and private companies to uphold environmental standards, and the many economical benefits. Climate action is still possible without the agreement. In fact, it's almost guaranteed to still happen because of the external pressures, as the US's example shows. The countries in the agreement may act like it's having a significant impact on their climate action, but it certainly isn't the driving force they want you to think it is. The negative teams try to tell you that leaving the Paris Agreement will result in extreme weather events becoming the norm. But Australia can implement effective climate policies completely independent of the Paris Agreement. Australia can develop and adopt its own national strategies to address climate change, invest in climate resilience measures, and enhance disaster preparedness. Same with the US example before, we don't need the Paris Agreement to make these decisions. And these actions alone can significantly mitigate the impacts of these extreme weather events. Why do we need to be locked into an international agreement to manage what is happening in Australia? The negative team has tried to tell you that Australia is still responsible for significant emissions. Withdrawing from the Paris Agreement doesn't mean denying responsibility for that, and climate action is still possible and highly likely without the agreement. Again, the US example I mentioned earlier, we could still take action without the agreement. We still will with external pressures. Withdrawing from the agreement doesn't mean not taking this environmental responsibility. It just means acting independently instead, which the US has proved to work just fine. The negatives team has tried to tell you that withdrawing from the Paris Agreement will hurt our international reputation and overall credibility. But this assumes that global standing is solely determined by participation in these international climate agreements, which is simply not true. Public reputation is multifaceted and influenced by many factors much beyond environmental commitments. To quote renowned scientist Joseph S. Nye Jr., a nation's reputation relies on its culture, its political values, and its foreign policies. Australia's reputation is shaped by its contributions to trade, innovation, diplomacy, and regional stability, not just its alignment to this one agreement. First, I'll be summarizing the points made by our first speaker, Haley. The Paris Agreement is failing at its primary goal of reducing global warming. Lots of countries are failing to meet their pledged NDCs due to an inherent flaw with the size of the agreement. Huge emitters like China are completely unrestrained, and even if all goals are met, it's predicted to only reduce global temperature by 0.05 degrees. The Paris Agreement also focuses to laser focus on the sole goal of reducing emissions, and its boundaries fail to address the many financial and economical issues that come with this laser focus. There is an astronomical price on investing into the agreement's goals this heavily, which leads to increased business costs and therefore lower after-tax profits, lower business investment, employment growth, and wages growth. We shouldn't be investing into an agreement that has been shown to be fundamentally flawed, especially if doing so significantly hurts our economy while making little global impact. Now, I'll be summarizing the points made by our second speaker, Samantha. Many of our supply chains, especially those needed for renewable practices like copper for solar panels and cobalt for electric vehicles, rely on the mining of critical minerals. Because the mining processes for these minerals have high carbon footprint, the Paris Agreement forces us to basically shut them down immediately. We instead should be focusing on balancing between reducing emissions and keeping up critical mineral production, or our economy will crash with the sudden change. The global agreement also doesn't tailor to Australia's unique environmental situation. Unlike Europe, where the agreement was signed, we live on a relatively small island, and we have intense heat events, very high bushfire risk, risk, and frequent droughts and floods that the agreement fails to account for. In conclusion, we, the Affirmative team, strongly agree that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. We believe this because it doesn't work as intended, ignores economical barriers, restricts critical minerals for our economy, and is not a good fit for our environmental situation. Thank you for listening.
I now call upon the third negative speaker, Alex Falkner.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic for today's debate is that Australia should withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and we, the negative team, strongly believe this statement to be false. As the third speaker for today's debate, I will be summarising my team's points. However, I will first be rebutting many of the negative affirmative team's points. The first affirmative speaker has attempted to tell you that leaving the Paris Agreement would allow Australia to prioritise economic growth over environmental regulations. However, this argument overlooks the long-term economic impacts of climate change, which could be far more damaging than the short-term regulatory cost. According to a report by the Global Commission on Adaptation, failing to address climate change could lead to significant economic losses globally. Remaining in the Paris Agreement, on the other hand, helps Australia to be part of a global strategy that mitigates these risks and fosters sustainable economic growth. The second affirmative speaker has then tried to tell you that leaving the Paris Agreement would allow Australia to exploit its natural resources. However, this fails to consider the potential global backlash and trade implications. A study from the World Trade Organization indicates that countries not adhering to global climate agreements may face trade penalties and marketing access issues. Staying in the Paris Agreement helps Australia avoid these risks and ensures continued access to international markets. The second affirmative speaker has then tried to tell you that leaving the Paris Agreement would allow Australia to focus on national priorities. But in reality, the consequences of climate change, such as rising sea levels and more frequent natural disasters, are already impacting the lives of Australians now. The Australian Academy of Science Climate Report by the President, Professor Andrew Holmes, states that staying in the Paris Agreement will help Australia better adapt to these challenges by fostering international cooperation and access to climate finance. It is clear to see that Australia's national interests are best served by staying in the Paris Agreement, as it proves both the framework and the resources need to protect our country from the worst impacts of climate change. The second affirmative speaker has then pointed to the United States, which has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement under the Trump administration, claiming that it illustrates the viability of opting out. However, the US rejoined the agreement after the Biden administration, signaling a commitment to international cooperation. This highlights that countries recognize the value of collaboration as the US aims to lead global efforts in emission reduction. Additionally, the US has made significant strides in reducing emissions through market-driven solutions without abandoning international commitments. The third affirmative speaker has next argued that leaving the Paris Agreement would allow Australia to develop its own climate solutions. Nevertheless, this undermines the benefits of international collaboration. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, emphasizes that shared research and technology development accelerate progress in climate solutions, with international partnerships often leading to faster technological advancements. Staying in the Paris Agreement provides Australia with access to global innovations and partnerships, enhancing its own technological advancements and climate strategies. The third speaker has then proposed focusing on adaptation rather than emissions reduction. However, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change emphasizes that mitigation and adaptation are both crucial in addressing climate change. Investing in emissions reductions now can prevent more severe impacts and costs in the future, making it a necessary component of any comprehensive climate strategy. Thus, the necessity of emissions reduction alongside adaptation strengthens the case for remaining in the Paris Agreement. Going back to the first speaker, she has argued that Australia should leave the Paris Agreement because major emitters like China are not held to the same standards. While it is true that China do have different targets, they are part of a global effort with differentiated responsibilities based on their developmental stages. According to the Climate Action Tracker, these countries are making significant strides in transitioning to renewable energy. Australia, as a developed nation with higher per capita emissions, has a responsibility to lead by example. Therefore, rather than leaving the Paris Agreement, Australia should stay and demonstrate global leadership in reducing emissions, which is crucial in ensuring international cooperation and accountability. Moving on to our summary, our first speaker for today, Rachel, started by stating that the Paris Agreement preserves Australia's global partnerships, proven in a study by Professor Emma Patterson of the Monash University, which states that we would most likely lose relationships with trading partners such as China, Japan, and Korea if discontinued. She then stated that if we were to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, we would lose great credibility and influence, as we would not be staying true to our commitment and we would be seen as unreliable, uncommitted to helping the environment, and indecisive. Our second speaker, Olivia, then stated the science behind reducing global warming through the Paris Agreement, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment report stresses the importance of limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees to prevent severe climate impacts. She then moved on to state the end goal that would be achieved, that we protect our planet and the CO2 levels in the atmosphere are decreased. Finally, she described how it is an incredible opportunity to build the future economy of our country with green technology, as highlighted by the RBA, as they state that increased investment in renewable projects, particularly in large-scale solar and wind generation, has driven economic growth. So, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson, for the reasons that my team and I have stated today, I'm sure that you can now clearly see why Australia should remain in the Paris Agreement, as it benefits our economy and society alike. Thank you.
I call upon a representative of the adjudication panel to come forward and award the debate.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Chelsea Harana. I'm one of the senior adjudicators on the panel for today's Grand Final Year 10 Grand Final debating. So congratulations, both teams coming from the same school is a cause worth celebrating. Your coaches and your supporting families and friends must be so proud of you all today. As each of the 5 adjudicators has arrived at his or her decision independently, there is no individual feedback. Today's decision was split. It's a decision of 3-2, and this has gone to the affirmative team. Congratulations.
I call upon a member of the runner-up team to give a vote of thanks.
We are very grateful to be here today. It's such a great opportunity, and we're so grateful to our coaches and our families and everybody for coming out and supporting us. We're grateful for the adjudicators for coming here tonight and spending time with us. Thank you, Chairperson and Timekeeper. And of course, thank you guys. They're our best friends. This is amazing. Thank you so much.
I call upon a member of the winning team to second that vote of thanks.
I'd just like to thank everyone. As they said, it's great to see all these Endeavour people here. It feels very cool. I would like to thank Monique for coming down to be our chairperson, come down from Murray Bridge, from Pedalpree, to come do that for us today. So we'd love to thank her for coming down for that. All the friendly faces looking out makes you feel very supported when you're up here. It's because it's a bit scary up here, not going to lie. But we'd also love to thank the opposition. Like, I was trying to write rebuttals and I was looking, I was smiling, then I was like, this is the enemy, don't smile. But yes, we'd like to thank everyone for coming out here. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance, and I now declare this debate closed.